Well, here we are in Whitehaven on the Irish Sea. My father's older sister was married to the treasurer of this little town, Whitehaven. He was a delightful man. All my relatives were. My aunt was born in 1905, my father in 1906, and I'm not sure about Aunt Ivy's husband, Uncle Tony. The city was so charming. Well, town was so charming. We ate fish and we laughed, and I met my first cousins for the first time. We went to pubs. We ate like the English did. Isn't it odd that I would remember the food so much? And the vistas, for example, this one for Oakbank, that was the address. Simple address. You write them the Thorleys, Oakbank, Whitehaven, England, and it gets to them. A view from the window the room I stayed in, the garden. Of course, the British love their gardens, don't they? I remembered all looking back at seeing this film for the first time in probably 35 years. What an impression this made on me. There's Aunt Ivy. There's my two cousins, my father, myself. My father took the camera at this point. And some of my favorite things to photograph: dogs, Aunt Ivy, Uncle Tony. Typical Englishman smoking a pipe. Flowers. What does one think of in British gardens? Flowers. Here, my father and I left my uncle and aunt, and we went to Liverpool, England. This is where my father was born and where Aunt Ivy was born. We actually visited the home where my father was born in, right in this house at number 1 Liscard Road. And the people that were living there in 1964 invited us in, and we saw the actual room my father was born in. Here's some street scenes of Liverpool at the time. You can see the young people dressed like the Beatles, very impressionable. And here's my father and I taking a ferry across the Mersey. And the older people listening to this will remember there was a song in 1964 called Ferry Across the Mersey. Here's my father. I particularly like this shot. It's very evocative of a well-planned, which it wasn't, portrait of the man. Yours truly at the rail of the boat. So peaceful. 51 years ago. Hard to believe. Aha! West and East Berlin. What an experience that was. It was the beginning of the Cold War. Perhaps it was the height of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall had been up 3 years. We stayed in West Berlin, of course, at the Hotel Roxy that you just saw on the scene. That was on the Kurfürstendamm, the main street. It was like St. Catherine Street in Montreal. Those showcases were actually simulated in a recent movie called Bridge of Spies, with Tom Hanks playing a negotiator between East and West Berlin at prisoner exchange. My father and I wandered around West Berlin, and we even went to a nightclub. And the last scene you'll see in this Berlin clip shows a young woman I met at the nightclub by the name of Monica Puff. At least I think I pronounced her German last name correctly. So we took a bus tour that took us right into East Berlin. We stopped at one monument where 5,000 Russian soldiers are. That's the Brandenburg Gate in the background. We're en route to this mass graveyard where 5,000 Russian soldiers are buried. That last scene, you probably saw a man with an amputated leg, a war casualty, I believe. buildings whose names I've long forgotten. Street scenes, I'm sure that never will be repeated. I don't think they use horses and Checkpoint Charlie. That was a guard gate, a guard tower, I should say. And here's my father. We're going to that monument of commemorating 5,000 Russian soldiers. They're buried there underneath the monuments. Mother Russia. Now here we are. We're driving around East Berlin in a tourist bus. Tourists had no trouble crossing into East Germany. The only people who had trouble were East Berliners coming back into West Germany. Any West German that went into East Berlin were happy, well, sure was very happy to get back. Here's a famous Checkpoint Charlie. This was a scene in the Bridge of Spies movie where one of the prisoner exchanges was made. This was a memory that will stay with me forever, as long as I live. The contrast between the built-up West and the still still war-torn east part of Berlin. And of course, in an effort to prevent people from escaping from East Berlin into West Berlin, it was necessary to literally block off the windows of some buildings that faced from east to west. You see them in the shots. A church that was in East Berlin, that's blocked off as well. A street in East Berlin, which I believe was in the movie with Tom Hanks. It's a poor shot, my father in the window. This is my symbolism. The only thing free, really, to easily cross the Berlin Wall were the birds. There's Monica Pluff. This is the last scene in Berlin. So we flew Air France to Paris, and Paris was everything I read about it and more. It was romantic, it was ancient, it was the kind of city I would like to live in. We spent only a few days there, but those were very memorable days. We stayed in a hotel on Rue Bonaparte, just down the street from the Café de Magat and down the street from the École des Beaux-Arts. We could see the Boulevard Saint-Germain-des-Prés at the bottom of the street, the bookstores along the Seine, and of course, here's my father crossing one of the ponts to the Louvre. A Frenchman. Typical, isn't it, with beret. A tour bus. And on the Seine itself, these boats that you see were called bateau mouche. This is an outdoor swimming pool that was actually harbored on the Seine River. My father and famous Eiffel Tower. Cliche, but one you have to see when you go to Paris, or you can't escape seeing. Here we are in a taxi, heading towards the Arc de Triomphe, Champs-Élysées. The gendarme. everywhere history. And of course, I was fortunate because history fascinated me. I simply wasn't interested in things that maybe perhaps 19-year-old boys should be interested in. However, the beautiful women of Paris did appeal to me. You saw my father hanging out the window of the Hotel de Londres there. We took mostly drip dry clothing with us. A new shirt that didn't have to be ironed. It just dried nice and conveniently flat. Now we return from Paris back to England again, and this is with my other set of relatives in Essex. This is Southend-on-Sea, a resort that very much like Brighton, except this is in the county of Essex, about an hour by train from London. This was a branch of the family too that were delightful. I'm very lucky that all my English relatives were so receptive to meeting me. This was my first trip to England. I made about 4 trips after this. I haven't been there since 1985. Everybody's grown up. And you'll see a baby in this movie coming up that's now 51 years old. Here's the Tower of London. I was able to write for an appointment to view the behind-the-scenes student arms collection. I spent an educational morning in the tower studying antique firearms, which was my specialty and helped get me into museum work, where I became a curator of a collection that predominantly was made up of antique firearms belonging to Canadian Industries Limited. That occurred just 4 years after this film was shot. Here's a scene so typical of the tower. Guards, beefeaters, and here we are at an arms shop owned by Wilkinson Sword, who actually really are well known in England for making razor blades. Here we are at Piccadilly Circus. My father took my 2 female cousins and myself to see A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles' first movie in 1964. Now, a family visit. Something I'm not terribly fond of because I've never had one, a baby. We're off to see my first cousin, my oldest first cousin, who she and her husband just had a child, and that child now, as I said, is 51 years old. Here he is. Here he is right here, young, I forget what his name was. Uncle Tony and my other uncle. There's baby Ian. Now it comes to me. Named after his father. There was my father with the Kodak still camera we took with us. And here we are, my father showing a tube of rock candy, which actually at the point concealed a sword. Here we are back in La Salle, Quebec. My father and my mother, their friends, Ernie and Priscilla Lingard. Everyone dead now. Here they are outside of 123 La Charité in La Salle, where I grew up. There, the Lingards pulling away. Now the next scenes, the majority of the next footage is, from a technical point of view, terrible. It's not properly exposed, for whatever reason I can't remember. And I don't know if anybody seeing this has noticed, because I was essentially a still photographer, where I created one frame of film that would stand by itself. I've been taking photographs since 1957. I shot the motion picture, most of this amateur movie, not letting enough frames of film run through the camera. In other words, the scenes are too short. Rather than being 8 or 10 seconds, they're 4 seconds, and that's not enough time to really digest. Also, I wasn't a technician enough to expose the film properly, and you can see this dead blank screen is a consequence of incorrect exposure. And I suppose at the time I was stingy with the film because it cost a lot of money to, at least in my youthful mind, the film itself and the processing, etc. Actually, I think the processing was included, but it was still an expensive proposition to create a movie. Also, I remember the camera. This predates Super 8, where you just drop a cartridge into the camera by 1 year. 1964 was regular 8. In 1965, it was Super 8. The camera was difficult to load, and it became a burden to do the 10 or so steps to load the camera, run it through once, then you had to reverse the film, load it again through the 10 steps, and hope for a good outcome. In the case of if you've been hanging in there, it's not a good outcome. This is shooting in Vermont. What you see in the film now is an 1863 Sharps carbine. I made the combustible cartridges, cast the bullets for this particular firearm. This is the one I used in 1967 to sell and buy a diamond ring for my wife. I bought it for $75 and I sold it for $125, which in 1967 would buy you a diamond ring. And that, to my friends who have been patient enough to watch this, is the end of this 18-minute 1964 very amateur home movie.